Earthlings, how are you doing? Right, I've got to sort out some technical things as I've never done this jointy malarkey again. So here's Chris Bryant. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Roger. How are you doing?
I'm doing grand. So, all right, I can see your thread over there. I've never done the kind of joint thing before, so.
Yes, yeah, I'm just broadcasting from OBS on my side, so if we're going on your Streamlabs, then we're all good.
Yeah, you seem a bit quiet, so let me boost your volume.
Okay.
Okay, I've done that. All right.
How's that?
Yeah, I think that's okay. So, for my people, just let me do a little bit of housekeeping.
Please.
I always say that the best interactive chat is on the YouTube rather than on the Facebook feeds. And also, I don't do all that malarkey about making any money out of these things. So there's no super chats and all that kind of stuff on my channel. So just chat away. And
there is on mine, just to.
So there's a few people online. So how are we going to do this then, Chris? Because this is interesting stuff. A discussion with what do you call me, a grumpy old man? So grumpy old man versus.
Did I say that? I'm sure I didn't.
I think you did.
Oh really? Oh dear. Okay. Well, yeah. Listen, I'm a grumpy old man in the making, so I won't hold it against you. I hope to one day be a grumpy old man. And yeah, well, why don't we both give a bit of introduction so that each other's audience know who we are, and then also talk a bit about how we got here, I guess.
Yeah, well, let's do it in alphabetical order. So off you go.
Sure thing. Yeah. Well, my name is Chris Bryant. I run a research consultancy called Bryant Research, and we work with a lot of animal organizations on social science research. So we'll do polling, we'll do economic and healthcare and environmental modeling, we'll do expert interviews, focus groups, research that is really designed to help improve the strategy of animal organizations and also to help them to make the case to government, for example, for the benefits of moving towards a plant-based food system overall. So that's me. My PhD's in psychology. Before that, I studied business and also policy research. And I suppose it's worth saying that pertinent to this conversation, the main thing that I talk about on my YouTube channel is a concept called Vegan 2.0, which we're going to discuss and get into.
You've been vegan since 2019, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned your research and your methodology, because I have a couple of questions about that. Because I taught qualitative methodology at UCD and for 1 year at MA level. So I'm quite interested in the methodology that you might be using and stuff. So it's interesting that you said things like focus groups and surveys, that kind of stuff. So are they online focus groups or in person?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I'd be happy to get into it. They're online for the most part.
Okay. And do you find that valid and reliable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it'll just be like a group call, basically. I think in some ways people are going to be more willing to express things that they might be a little bit nervous in person, because you have kind of social dynamics more so in an in-person setting than online. And so it's more, people might be able to be a bit more honest, you know.
Yeah, it could work the other way around because of the kind of barrier of the technology, but never mind. So in terms of me, for your audience then, I've been vegan since 1979. I was involved with lots and lots of single issue campaigns. I did the Sea Shepherd in Scotland type thing. I did all kinds of things, you know, hunt saboteurs and all that. And then I started doing quite a lot of the press for those kind of groups. And then I got involved with the Animal Liberation Front, or kind of more technically, it would be the Animal Liberation Front Supporters Group. That only lasted 8 months because I got nicked. And so that was the end of that kind of thing. And then in terms of academia, I've done an MA on the animal protection movement. And my PhD is about the support pillars of cultural speciesism. So that's me in a nutshell, I suppose. At the moment, I'm with the Vegan Information Project in Dublin.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks for giving that overview. And so I think probably a useful place to start is just briefly like the story of how we got here. Do you want to give your version? I think it starts off, you saw that photo of my presentation, hey?
Yes, that's right. So kind of like you could say it's all Animal Justice Project's fault, all of this.
Well, only insofar as they shared the photo, right?
Because they chose to show a photo. So I've got a couple of things that we can have a look at. So to the right is your photo, obviously, and so this is your Vegan 2.0, and what you call Vegan 1.0 is to the left there, right? And so I think the Animal Justice Project, they just kind of threw a few pictures up. And funny enough, Chris, you know, if they hadn't have picked this slide, it wouldn't have happened because, I mean, we didn't know each other a week ago, right? And so that's an interesting one in itself. But yeah, and so obviously what I did, until you clarified it, was look at the worst forms of exploitation bit. And that's what most of the people who saw my thing. So I did say, in fairness, and I think you latched onto this, that I was seeking clarification.
Yes, you did, yeah.
Who is this guy? I wanted to know who you were. And is this another dilution of veganism? Because what you call Vegan 1.0, from my point of view, is a dilution of veganism from, you know, so from previous decades and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of the discussion, I do have a couple of notes here, which is quite interesting. You said that what everybody's missing is the distinction about the words excluding and preventing. Is it preventing?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. And so do you want to just run through what that differentiation will mean to you?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's yeah, a good summary from you know, how we've ended up here. I appreciate you've got the controversial photo that started it all. Yeah, so I think
I cut you out, so I didn't want to embarrass you.
Not embarrassed. Come on, I thought I looked quite good in that picture personally, but never mind. So yeah, I think you were not alone in noticing mainly this part, the worst forms of exploitation. So I see a lot of people on the picture of the slide were commenting, you know, is this to say that less bad forms of exploitation are okay? And, you know, who's to be the judge of what are the worst forms and stuff like this. So I think that this framing on its own, I can certainly see how people have taken it the wrong way. And it's worth saying that in the context of the presentation, it was kind of clear that, yeah, the meaning was a bit more clear in the context, right? But yes, I think that the main thing that people have missed with that interpretation, is exactly as you say, is that the main difference really from veganism to Vegan 2.0 is about moving from excluding exploitation or cruelty or suffering, however you think about that layer of it, to actually actively preventing. And that being the case, it's not possible for one person to prevent all of the exploitation or suffering. And so you have to prioritize, and it makes sense to focus on the worst forms, you know, however that's quantified.
Yeah, okay. So what you said on Facebook was the key thing you're missing, and you were talking to everybody really. I was dropping in and out as you do. That Vegan 1.0 is about excluding exploitation, i.e. don't do anything yourself, whereas Vegan 2.0 is about preventing exploitation, i.e. stopping others from doing it. Yeah, because
That's right, yeah.
the reason that I said, okay, well, let's have a chat then, because I'm characterizing this as a conversation and not a debate. But is the fact that, you know, you're suggesting that the word exclusion automatically means on a personal level, and is that what you think the vegan society meant by the word?
That is certainly my interpretation, yeah. And I do think that that's most people's interpretation. I know that some people in the thread were saying this is already entailed in veganism, like a proper vegan position understands this already, and it basically entails activism as well. I think that most people think of those as different things, such that if you eat cheese, for example, we're going to say that you're not vegan, but if you or have a vegan diet and don't use animal products and so on, but you don't do any activism, I think that most people will still say that you're a vegan. And I think people think of activism as kind of a separate thing. So, yeah,
Well,
I think that
there is quite a long and nuanced debate about that very point. The fact that obviously a lot of vegan activists try to encourage people to also be activists as well. If I can just move on to this slide here, this is from 1947. So this is Faye Henderson, right? And there's quite a lot of these appeals within the vegan social movement to educate yourself in order to educate others. So it wasn't purely about just, as it were, the purity of individuals. It's about learning the case and then spreading it around. For example, Faye Henderson here, she was a prime mover within the vegan movement, and she did tours. A lot of them did tours all around Britain and Ireland even. And so they spoke at vegetarian conferences and this kind of stuff. So Matthew Meltzer here, he's a sociologist. He's working for the Donald Watson Archive. So they're going through a lot of the historical documents. You know, the Donald Watson family gave them access to his notes and archives and stuff. And what Matthew says is that Faye Henderson initiated, this is in the 1940s, the consciousness raising model for vegan activism. So I would suggest that there's no suggestion within the vegan movement, the vegan social movement, that veganism is about anything personal. It's always been about other people involved, and that's what you got pushback from. Kay Bealey said veganism has always been about trying to stop others from harming our fellow animals. So she said that on the thread, right? Now, I think, did you accept that? I think you said what you've just said, that most people think it's about personally abstaining. So, this brings us to a really interesting question that I wanted to explore with you, really, which was, does the vegan society play any role in what's going on here? I mean, have you run Vegan 2.0 past them? Have they commented on it? Are they interested in it? Or are they totally irrelevant? Do you think that the two definitions will sit side by side? How do you see how the movement would embrace it if they chose to?
Yeah, interesting question. And yeah, I definitely think most people distinguish doing sort of proactively preventing, as I would say, exploitation or suffering as its own thing, and think of veganism as you can't have animal products, right? Basically, that's the main part of it in practice. So yeah, funnily enough, actually, my good friend of mine from the Vegan Society also was seeing that presentation for the first time, and I did say to me afterwards, I think there could be it's calling it Vegan 2.0 suggests that it's like next evolution of veganism itself. When always in practice, when I talk about it, I say this is to be practiced alongside veganism. Obviously, I think people ought to be vegan. And a part of Vegan 2.0 is sharing things to try and encourage people to move in that direction. So, I mean, I think that just is how people are mainly using the term vegan at the moment, to just be about one's own practices. And, really this comes from the idea of vegans getting frustrated with the inability to be perfect in that respect. And there's a lot of pragmatic situations that you might find yourself. You need to take medicine that contains milk powder. You need to take a taxi that has leather seats or something like that, where I can see people being distressed by these situations. And from my perspective, I'm thinking, look, this is the world we have, and there's really going to be diminishing returns by trying to be perfect at avoiding or excluding, and basically using our limited attention and resources and time. There are many more things that we can do to help many, many more animals than like sweating the small stuff, basically. So I think that's probably an area where we'll tend to disagree somewhat.
Yeah, this is the kind of stuff that Leonard and Sebastian Joy talk about. The don't sweat the small stuff, because it's better to have so many imperfect vegans more than a small group of perfect vegans. But I find, I know in your thread you said you're going to ask me, can you be a perfect vegan? Now, I would need that question to be clarified, because I see veganism as a philosophy. And so are you saying, can you perfectly agree with the philosophical thing? Because I think what's behind these type of questions is, can you be a perfect plant-based eater?
Well, I would say, like, can you practice veganism perfectly? I think it's one thing to believe in the philosophy, and it's kind of strange to talk about, like, can you perfectly believe something, I guess.
No, but that's exactly why they put the practicable and possible in the definition, because they realized there was a tension between those two things you've just talked about, the philosophy and the practice.
Right. And is that something, I presume that that's something that you disagree with?
Well, no, I would say that, given the fact that we live in a cultural speciesist society, drenched in the ideology of speciesism and animal welfare, then it's very difficult to have a 100% plant-based lifestyle. You brought up the kind of difficult thing, maybe medicine, but you talk about things like leather seats in cars. Now, obviously, if a vegan goes and buys a car, I imagine that they will not buy one with, the skin of our fellow animals in it. But in terms of getting into a taxi with one, I mean, I would be, as you kind of alluded to there, I would possibly get in, but I'd feel pretty shitty about it. And I mean, but then again, I wouldn't want to get into a Elon Musk car either. Big and that would go back to what I understand veganism to be, which is a justice for all philosophy. It's the ultimate peace movement.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, I think you don't need to feel shitty if you get the taxi with the leather seats, because there's so much. I'm very like quantitative in the way that I think about these things. I think that's another probably interesting diversion between.
Would you use the word regretful? You'd be.
I wouldn't at the moment thinking about it, because I would know that my donations and my sharing things on social media, my take part in organized activism, is doing so much good on the other side. It'd be like trying to save a few pennies on my groceries instead of focusing on getting like a 50k raise at work.
This is like you're doing an immediate utilitarian calculus. But I mean, like, you're sat there and you're looking down and you're thinking, Jesus, this is leather. I mean, it must. You wouldn't kind of even think about it.
I mean, I'm certainly capable of occupying that mindset where I'm like, well, it's actually quite grim if you think about the reality of what's happening right now. Definitely, I can appreciate that one could respond that way, but in terms, I wouldn't think that that's like a helpful thing to spend much time like trying to optimize. If I have to wait for 3 taxis to come and go before I get one that doesn't have leather seats and it makes me late for a meeting, I'm like, it's probably doing more harm than good at that point.
If you weren't pushed for time, then maybe it would be a good idea. But it's it's an interesting thing. I think it's just on a kind of human level of the fact that we are human beings. We adhere to the vegan philosophy, and it's a bit shitty that there's a car here with the skin of one of our fellow animals in it, and that I would obviously spend a bit more time thinking about that bit than you would, and if there was a way of avoiding it, which you're going to say it doesn't really make much of a difference in the scheme of things, but I still probably would go to that thing of going, okay, well, if I ring this company rather than that company, I mean, if I knew that, then I'd do it. You would do that, wouldn't you?
Well, I'm thinking about Uber now, and so it's just you get whatever car you get, right? That is not necessarily going to be.
Well, I've never
you don't necessarily know
I
when.
don't know anything about it, so.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, look, I suppose if you're thinking about a situation where you have 2 taxi companies in your town and one of them has all their cars have leather seats and one of them all their cars don't have leather seats, then you could make you could say, okay, consuming the one is more vegan than consuming the other. But there's going to be a ton of similar scenarios where there's some small amount of animal product consumption that is basically unavoidable. Another one is like there's a little bit of egg and flu shots, right? But I'm still gonna get my flu shots. I realize that that's not ideal, and right, we'll hopefully get to a world where that's not the case. But I'm not going to not have a flu shot in the meantime, right? So there's all these kind of cases where I think there's just very, very small amount of utility to be gained for like a large effort to try and avoid the thing, and that'll be increasingly. You will always be able to find some imperfection, and my thing is just to say to people, it's way more helpful to animals to focus on the massive gains that you can be made by giving more, sharing more, and doing more, which I talk about, than to, pay, for example, like pay extra to go to the taxi company that doesn't have the leather seats or something like that.
Well, yeah, those would be factors that you. And actually, on a personal note, I'm in a strange situation when it comes to vaccines because I've never had one.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I'm 68, as you pointed out in your live stream, and I've never had one. My mother, I think, was opposed to them, but not on any particular grounds, apart from she had this thing about it's a bit weird putting poison into yourself. I think that was her rationale, which may or may not actually make sense. And but I understand the science of it. I mean, it's a little bit like homeopathy in a way, isn't it? A little bit will create a bodily response. If I've got that right, but I've never kind of bothered with them. I've just never had one.
Yeah, you could say that. I'm not sure I believe in homeopathy, but I do think vaccines are a good thing. But I see what you're saying. It's a similar sort of.
The principle is similar. They introduce something in order to create a response. Is that wrong?
Well, if you frame it in those kind of terms, I suppose both things are doing that. I think there's evidence that vaccines work, but I don't think there's evidence that homeopathy works.
Yeah, okay. Well, if you're going to get hooked up on the efficacy of homeopathy, but I was just trying to see if the scientific rationale for it was kind of similar, really.
I don't know. It's an interesting framing. I've never thought of it in those terms.
I know it's a little bit weird. Let me go back to this. I'm not going to spend any time on it. I just want to kind of ram my point home, as it were. Now, this is Matthew again, and he's looked at the history of the vegan movement, and he's basically saying that right from the beginning there was this idea that you'd end up with an emancipated vegan self, a more compassionate human society, and it was about these interconnected goals, about it's transformative, and that's how the founders saw what veganism was all about. It's going to transform human beings for the good, and in fact, they said that vegan values were part and parcel of the moral evolution of humanity. This one is basically saying the same, but this is more like an appeal to the movement that I think Matthew is probably recognizing that, veganism has kind of moderated out a little bit, and it might be quite good to recenter the philosophical meaning of veganism. And the quote from Watson is, towards the end of his life, he was making repeated appeals to the movement not to forego the original founding values of veganism. And I suppose I would argue, and you might not, that they have kind of gone. And then again, this is the one where he says, if the vegan ideal of non-exploitation were generally adopted, it would be the greatest peaceful revolution ever known. And what you get from people like Kathleen Janaway is that if the vegan ideal of non-exploitation were generally adopted, vegan values would end war and poverty, she argued in 1992. So for the founders of our movement, the movement that we've joined subsequently, you recently, me in the 70s, the founders of our movement had these radical ideas. They were real kind of English radicals with a revolutionary idea. And the reason for that is it comes from the fact that the vegan social movement was born out of the ashes of the war. And they'd seen how human beings had got violent, which is kind of ironic in a way, because they hadn't yet, I don't think, learned about the Holocaust that much. They hadn't learned about the nuclear bombs in Japan, for example, right? And so I think that they were just going, what has happened to humanity? We need some idea to bring it out of the moral trough that we're in. And they came to conclude that it was about veganism and vegan values. So this is Watson 88, talking about the movement again. And he's saying the movement is but a child, needs all the support it gets. And, again, kind of an appeal. And then just before he died, or 2 years before he died, Watson is writing to Arthur Ling. Do you know who Arthur Ling is?
No.
Okay, so he's like the co-founder with Leslie Cross of Plant Milks, Plamil, the company Plamil.
Oh,
and
cool.
he says, since veganism by definition claims to help animals and people, obviously we would word it in different ways now, the vegan society must do its part in showing how to bring it about. So what I'm trying to get across, well, we know about that one. You mentioned that enough. We can skip that. What I'm trying to get is that they were very proactive in terms of being activists right from the start. They wanted to educate themselves to educate others, as I said. So this is Calva. Now, this is a person, you might know her, still works, I think, at the Vegan Society. I think she was once called the historian. She's now called the chief communication officer, I think. And she's pointing out that, well, it's a really interesting story because the beginning of the Vegan Society was pretty chaotic. And that was the fault, in a way, which is a good fault, of the Vegetarian Society. So I don't know whether you want me to go into that story, but basically they trotted along in 1944. This is Elsie, Shrigley and Watson. And they said, can we have a non-dairy section, please, vegetarians? And they said, no, right? They said, the best thing for you to do, because we want to continue concentrating on flesh, best thing for you to do is start your own movement. And so that's what they did, but they didn't know they were going to do that. They didn't know that the vegetarians were going to say no. But in my estimation, it's the biggest favor that the vegetarians ever did to veganism, because within 10 years, they worked out the philosophy of veganism, which got more and more and more radical. You were talking about the diet aspect of it in your live stream. It quickly went away from that, because they used to be called non-dairy vegetarians in those days. And they quickly moved away from that. And they started to radicalize and radicalize until we end up in 1954 with an essay called The Surge of Freedom by Leslie Cross. And that's like the final, I suppose, statement of radical vegan philosophy. And that has gone. As soon as Cross stopped working for the Vegan Society, the Vegan Society started to moderate, which I think is a terrible, terrible sadness and kind of indictment, really. This is just the same, really, but the aim is not to make the present relationship between man and animal more tolerable, obviously the sexist language of the time. And above that, we've come out on the side of the liberators. This is not about welfare, this is about freedom. Now, he says that twice in 2 separate essays, right? And then the final one is this one. So now we've moved into the 60s. This is Jack Sanderson, the editor of the Vegan magazine. It is the task of the present generation of vegans to erase from the face of the earth all the wrong exploitation of the collective life of the earth, that of the creatures, the plants, and that of humanity. So I know you said disparaging things about the concept of intersectionality. I would suggest that if we're going to have a conversation about that we use David Nybert's idea, which is the entanglements of oppression and liberation, because it basically means the same. There was a live stream the other day with Carol Adams. Do you know who Carol Adams is?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and she was saying that, you know, intersectionality has caused quite a bit of upset in the movement, which is true. But we don't need that. To say the same thing as what pro-intersectionality means, we don't need to use the word, especially because a lot of modern day vegans think it's an identity, which it's not, it's a toolbox. But before that, the feminists were coming up with ideas which were the same, you know. And again, I always go for David Nybert, the entanglements of oppression and liberation, that these issues of liberation are interlinked, which is kind of intersectionality, right? So that's a bit of a, well, I'll try to keep it short, but that's my kind of opening gambit about how radical the vegan movement used to be. And that's why I said on my description that I think we're both going to agree that we might think that some modification of what you call vegan 1.0 is needed. You move forward to think, I would want to go back to the more radical times and say, hey, look at this is brilliant, right?
I see what you're saying. Maybe we're kind of shoehorsing to some extent, as they say, in that respect, if we're to the extent that we're both talking about moving beyond personally excluding. There's a lot there that thank you for preparing well and like making slides and everything and watching the live show. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that, and I have read a little bit about your views as well, so hopefully we're set up for a good conversation here. Yeah, well, that's cool that we are similarly concerned with moving beyond personal exclusion. I really think that that's going to be something with diminishing returns, as I've said, and I often try to think about it from the perspective of what would a factory farming executive want the animal movement to be focused on, so as to be as inefficacious as possible against their business, basically. And I think like having everybody be very much focused on, I need to personally be pure in the sense of what I'm consuming, is a great way to waste their limited amount of energy and resources, in my view.
Yeah,
and so
I think the discourse about purity, which is often described as all or nothing and everything, I think that's more of a slur than a reality, because I've never known anyone who said to somebody, say on the street or anything, do all or nothing. I know that's Leonard's line, but I've never known anybody say that. And then, but you're talking about on the personal level, right? But you know, there's nothing wrong with trying to be consistent with your morals. Surely you'd agree with that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think people should try to be consistent. Yeah, I do agree with that.
That's all it is.
Yeah, and that's fine. And like I say, there's going to be some cases like the flu jab and things like this where it's like, look, this is some practical exception to, and that's fine. It sounds like you're saying you don't like necessarily disagree with that's sometimes necessary, and that it's more important to focus on proactively doing good and preventing the exploitation. And maybe there's an interesting conversation for us to have about how best to do that as well. I guess that's more of an empirical discussion. But yeah, when I think about these things, it definitely is with a more utilitarian framing, where I'm like thinking about the number of animals that this is going to affect, thinking about how much it's going to affect their suffering in one direction or another. And I think that will tend to lead us to quite different things that we'll tend to support. But I think often as well, those things end up pointing towards the same common ideal. I'm just having a shorter, like, what's the next step? What's the pragmatic way to move this forward? Rather than, you could say, like a broader philosophical focus.
Yeah, I get your point. Deb is saying, this is Deb from the States. Well, we've agreed not to start swearing until 30 minutes in. So
that's right.
But, and I did want to say, I was going to say this at the beginning, because I know Philip might be here too. And everybody who went on the No Kings thing, wherever in the world, kind of well done for that. And kind of kudos to you and all that kind of stuff. Right, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, I think that's probably a fine place for you to. So, like, one implication of that is doing the cage-free stuff and the welfare reforms, which I know we probably also, there's some daylight between our positions on that. I've also written down, well, actually, I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, roughly. Well, I mean, obviously, we're not going to agree on the cage-free stuff. In fact, I saw my research on you this morning was watching your conversation with was it Virtue Post-Mortem?
That's right, yeah.
Now, that was really interesting because, first of all, I've not looked into animal welfare science for years and years and years, and I saw that you were frantically bringing it up on the screen while they were talking. So it was quite interesting because that's the kind of world that I've kind of left behind in a way to concentrate on veganism. And because I did do a report on controlled atmosphere stunning, which is now we're talking about the gas chambers and stuff, right? And this was as it was coming in. So I looked at all the research when that was all prototype type things. And it was really kind of fascinating because they were struggling with ideas about pockets of air. So they said we need to create turbulence within the gas chambers and all this kind of stuff. Now, one of the main groups that campaigned for the gas chambers was PETA, as in People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals.
Interesting.
Right? And now I imagine that they would be opposed to them because of as it's been put into practice over the years. That often is what happens with welfare reforms. You often get, I mean, another example would be, because when I came into the movement, 79, the battery cage thing was already on the go. What they didn't realize was that they would replace them with enriched battery cages, right? And then with so-called free range, quite a lot of people who campaigned for it are now critical of it, right? And not least because of some of the things that came up in your talk with Virtue Post-Mortem about the fact that there's a PETA report suggesting that in some respects, the high welfare systems can be worse for our fellow animals than the more restrictive ones. And it was a really kind of interesting discussion. I'd encourage people to watch that if they want to get back into animal welfare science. But it was almost like going back in time for me. I even looked at an old video from Gary Francione. You know that name? Yeah. Okay. So a lot of the things that you stand for, he would claim, and I think he's right, that he kind of debunked it all in the 1990s. So we talk about, Animals, Property and Law, 1995, Rain Without Thunder, 1996, and onwards. The debate that you're still embroiled in was ongoing there. It was often wrapped up in the kind of abolitionist versus welfare type thing and all that, right? But I mean, I thought Virtue Post-Mortem did really well. Did you think you were struggling a bit?
No, yeah, she's very smart and very like. I think we certainly have disagreements, but want a lot of the same things. I think that's the case with a lot of the, I would say, anti-welfarism. I hesitate to say welfarism versus abolitionism because I think a lot of the people who are what you would call welfarists are eventual abolitionists, right? And certainly that's how I see it, that improvements to welfare standards, or for that matter, any other standards that you could put on farms. For example, they might have to observe certain environmental regulations and they can't pollute willy-nilly. They have to treat their workers like, yeah, minimum wage, safety requirements, all this kind of stuff. I think, again, it's like a pragmatic way that what part of what that is doing is pushing up the supply curve.
One of the main planks of your argument, if I understand it, if you make flesh products more expensive through welfare regulation, it means that the vegan meats, etc., will become competitive in the market. That
exactly.
Up, is it?
Exactly. Yeah, there are cost pressures on animal products. There are cost pressures on alternative proteins. And what we should be doing from like an institutional advocacy perspective is advocating for things that tend to favor alternative proteins in that respect. So I think as well, a lot of welfarists are hesitant to put this very clearly because, of course, this can be an argument that the animal industries can take and say, well, look, this is going to make food more expensive, and that's not what governments want to see happening, right? So that would be a government's main hesitation with passing these kind of things and like a reason not to do this. And in that case, you probably even find animal advocates saying, we promise that this won't increase the cost of food, right? Because pragmatically, again, for government dialogue, you have to consider what their incentives are. But yeah, I think that, like I say, it goes for welfare laws, and there I see that people can get the idea that I'm saying, which again, I'm not necessarily saying, and it's interesting what you said about Peter advocating for cage-free and then later, or advocating for the getting rid of the battery cages and then later like advocating against the system.
Gas chambers, it was.
Oh, the gas chamber, right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually perfectly coherent because I see it as a gradual process where, yeah, the standards that welfarists are advocating for today, if they're successful in advocating for them, they'll move on to some higher set of standards that they want to advocate for, and then they'll say, the thing that we were advocating for 5 years ago or 10 years ago is no longer acceptable because you're kind of trying to keep.
That might be one of the ways, but they also could just say we want to scrap what we brought in because it doesn't work, and there's nowhere else to go but back. There's got quite a lot of problems with this. I mean, like there's a lot of problems with the idea that if you regulate the shit out of animal agriculture, then the costs are going to go up. Well,
yeah.
Well, we don't know that. There is some research saying one way or the other, and you mentioned that in your thing. But the point is, who's going to check it out? Who's going to regulate that within a deeply speciesist culture? I mean, I can't see you getting your overalls on and going to have a look at the farms every week, right? So who's gonna, you say, well, we've brought in this thing. We know farmers break their welfare rules all the time.
For sure, there are enforcement problems. Yeah.
So what's the point of getting them if they're not going to be adhered to? No monitoring, and even then, what is it? Slap on the wrists?
Well, I agree that the regulations have to have teeth, ideally, right? You want it to be able to be enforced, and you want there to be serious consequences for not observing the law.
Yeah, but what does that mean, Chris? Enforced by whom?
Well, funny you should ask. At the moment, the responsibility for enforcing animal welfare laws, which are generally, like you say, are frequently violated in British farming. We do have some good animal welfare protections, but the enforcement infrastructure really is lacking, and that's a big problem. The responsibility for enforcing that at the moment, kind of bizarrely in my view, lies with local councils. So it'll be like the local council of the city or the town where you live is the body that's responsible for enforcing the standards on farms in that area. And of course, they don't really have the budget to do that. They normally have one person employed by each council who is responsible for sometimes thousands of farms in a particular area. It's not possible for them to inspect all of them. The farms kind of know that.
Yeah, but are you saying now then that you're kind of admitting really that we go to all the trouble of getting these things, but there's nobody to monitor it? The farmers are going to break the rules whenever they can, or they'll bend them and all that, which is what farmers do, you know. And so, you know, we spend years and years getting welfare reform that, in a sense, doesn't mean anything.
Well, I think there's, first of all, I don't, you know, while there is a lot of violations, I think that as a practice, it will make businesses adhere to that to a much greater degree than if there weren't regulations, right? It's like people still murder other people, but it's still good that we make murder illegal because we're setting some kind of standard, like this is what's expected. Now, there's more resources to enforce that, which haven't really been made available in the case of animal welfare to the same extent. But I would see that as just another aspect of policy to fix.
You did research on that. I mean, for example, have you looked at countries where there is animal welfare legislation and looked at countries where there isn't? Now, a lot of animal advocates assume that the ones that don't have it, everything's going to be worse. But do you know empirically whether that's true?
That does tend to be the case, yeah. There's a resource called Animal Protection. I think it's an Animal Protection International thing where they give grades basically to different countries in terms of their laws around farmed animal protection and also different types of animals.
How would they monitor that? And would it be longitudinal over time?
Well, varies by different country. And again, there is always going to be violations, like people break the law sometimes, right? But certainly in places where there are just no laws about how to treat farmed animals, then there's nothing even to be held to. I spoke to a lawyer a little while ago. This was an interesting conversation because she said to me, it's kind of, I guess there's an American context, but I imagine the same thing is true here. It's kind of encoded in the structure of a company as a legal entity that companies always want to be law abiding, is how she said it. And so the way that the
sounds a bit naive, to be honest.
Well, in theory, right? In theory. So like obviously companies do break the law, right, all the time. But she was saying to me that the responsibility then can be actually for the executive who makes that decision, like the individual who is running that company is responsible for ensuring that they don't break the law. And so, yeah, companies will, but again, in America, they have like next to no farmed animal protection laws, bar in California, which does have some, and that's trying to be, you know, they're trying to roll over that in the legislature at the moment. But yeah, I think certainly, you know, it's now the case that upwards of 70 or 80% even, I think, of our eggs in the UK are from cage-free systems. And now the government is looking at and consulting on and most likely going to ban cages in egg production systems overall. So
I saw you say that in that live stream. So what was the driving factors in that? Where does the 70% come from?
I think advocating for companies to adopt cage-free eggs and prioritize that and so on, and then they put pressure on the supply chain. Producers have to do what they're. There is also a demand side factor, definitely. Do you remember that Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall? I think it was Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall thing a few years ago. He did a big thing about free range versus caged eggs, and everyone, that was on at the time when we all watched the same thing on TV. So that got a lot of traction, but it has been a gradual process over time of increasing the percentage of eggs in the UK that come from non-cage systems.
Well, I mean, that's interesting from my point of view, because my position is that we need cultural change. It's far too early to go to politics unless it's for animal welfare reasons. I understand that politics and animal welfarism has got some symbiosis or anything, but in terms of politics and animal rights, just doesn't work. Animal rights as a concept is far too difficult and radical for politicians. They can't deliver it. And so what they do, and they've done this over the years, there's legislation in Ireland at the moment where this process is happening, is that they start off with an animal rightsy kind of idea and it slides into welfare because the system is based on that, you know, the system, and of course you're trying to get legislation through parliaments which are chock full of speciesists. So, you know, you got your work cut out anyway. So it seems to me that we need to change the culture, and that would then imply to me vegan education.
I certainly think that's a valuable part of it. I certainly think that's a necessary component of moving us all in that direction. And it's very fashionable in effective altruism circles, which has a big overlap with Vegan 2.0 that I talk about, to be focused on institutions rather than individuals. So the thinking is, obviously, if you persuade a government to change a law, or you persuade a big supermarket chain to change something in their supplier conditions or whatever, you're going to affect many, many more animals than like getting one extra person to go vegan, for example. But I think an important asterisk on that is that it does actually rely on enough individuals caring about the issue, and institutions are effective, but like ultimately beholden to individuals, such that, you know, the Prime Minister can't just come on telly tomorrow and say we're banning all factory farming if all of the voters still want to have their cheap animal products, because they'll just vote for the other guy, right, or the other girl. And likewise, you know, the CEO of Sainsbury's can't just come out and say we're going to stop having all factory farm products if all of the consumers still like put a lot of value on having cheap animal products, because they'll just go to Tesco instead.
So the demand side is crucial for us. Are you
100%.
cool about taking some questions before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, here's one from Wendy. I've seen a few as we've been talking, so we'll have a quick look. Do you see CIWF, that's compassionate wool farming? Do you think you're the same as that?
I'm sure we have a lot of overlap in terms of the kinds of legislation that we might seek to support and stuff like this. So yeah, if the question is meant to be like how original is it? Not especially, really. I've kind of just like, I haven't made any new resources or invented any part of Vegan 2.0. I always say it's give more, share more, and do more, right? So it's just donating to charities, to effective charities, sharing things on social media, and then taking part in organized online activism. So I didn't invent any of those things, but I'm kind of just branding it and putting it together and presenting it as like easy things people can do.
One question I've got in my back pocket is, I was going to ask it later, but it might as well pop up now, is do you think Vegan 2.0 is vegan?
In the way that Vegan 1.0 is focused on, to the extent that that's focused on exclusion, I think that it is two separate things. So
aren't you we're back to the start. You're misinterpreting the word exclusion, because when they used it, and of course because of their chaotic start and all that kind of stuff, you know, I mean, the definition that you're talking about is like 1979 to 88, but they started working on that something like 1967. You know, so words like exclude and exploitation, which we would have much more kind of nuanced critiques of now, they just use them like, well, exploitation means use, and you know, that kind of stuff. And so I think we have to kind of give them a little bit of latitude in terms of what they meant. But how do you know that when they said exclude, they mean from society?
Well, if that's the interpretation of that definition, then I think that's pretty similar to what I'm saying.
So it would rule out the need for Vegan 2.0 then, wouldn't it?
Well, I think that so you're using basically an earlier definition, which is a bit more all-encompassing, you could say. So I think those definitions are probably.
No, I'm going back to the definition that you're calling Vegan 1.0. I think it's a blanding thing. You know, it's been blanded out a little bit, because we know, I mean, as a sociologist, we know through social movement theory, and people like Corey Lee Wren have done lots of work on that, vegan sociologists, is that when a movement takes off or becomes professionalized, it tends to moderate. Now, that definitely has happened with the vegan social movement, sadly. So a radical start has been kind of chipped at until now. We've got, I mean, I know I said it in a kind of clickbaity type, but you know, we really do have a welfare shit show of a movement, because the animal rights elements of it have gone. You know, Reagan has been forgotten, Francione has left, you know.
I don't know about that. I guess that's like an empirical question as to how many vegans see it in different terms. Like there's certainly plenty of people in my audience who are also more oriented around thinking about rights rather than welfare or suffering, or however you would put it. But do you disagree that advancing welfare, for example, also advances rights, like through legislation, for example?
Well, it's interesting, because I think that ties into something that you said about 10 minutes ago, which is this idea that welfare can lead to abolition, because there's some really interesting work, and Richard Gale is involved in this, where it's the other way around. And so if you, and Casey Taft talks about this as well, who's a psychologist, and you know, we got this thing with the Melanie Joy cartel, ask the small ask, right? Whereas there's a lot of research saying that if you ask the big ask, which is quite ironic then, it means then that if you've got a radical abolitionist message, you end up with welfare. It's not as though you've got to climb up the other way, because the point is, going back to the system can't deal with the abolitionist or the rights thing. And so what Gale talks about, because we normally talk about the movement and counter movement, right? Now, he was interesting because he talked, so that's the dyad. He talked about the triad, which was the social movement, the counter movement, and then the state, right? And so the short version is that if the social movement creates what I've called social turbulence, what you end up is contact between the counter movement, you know, say the meat trade in your terms, right, and government ministers, right? And the government minister is on the phone, you know, to the flesh industry going, I'm getting a lot of flack here, do something about it. And of course, what they can do is welfare, right? And so looking at that model really pushes the way that even an abolitionist thing, you would end up with welfare on the way. But the important part of it, from my point of view, division of labor, is you don't have to campaign for it. You get it anyway.
It depends. I think so I understand what you're saying. There's a lot of contexts where either of those could be more true. There's a lot of empirical things that we could unpack there. Like, for example, I think I can see what you're saying, right? Like, make your sort of first offer the bigger one, and then you are negotiated down. And if you end up with welfare, then that's, you know, then you end up with welfare. I think there's contexts where that can be true. And I think there's also contexts where the reverse can be true, where like the government's consulting on the specifics of, I think with the cage-free thing, it's like when like by what year should we aim to bring this in? Is 2032 is the suggested thing, and then like should it be sooner than that? Is that adequate for businesses to prepare or whatever? There does come a time where you need to be like, okay, here's the you know, we've got to be pragmatic about what's possible here, and like give details on the kind of welfare improvement. What do we want? Slight improvements. When do we want it in 5 years? I mean, like, you know, I think that all we have is incrementalism in the execution. And if at that stage you're saying, I'm not going to take part in this because I think that is all wrong, then you don't get the incremental improvement. But I think
no, but I go back to, I mean, one of my main planks in terms of this discussion that we're having is division of labor. My position is that we do know that there are a lot of vegans who won't do vegan education. So fair enough, they can do, you know, they might want to do Camp Beagle, or they might do X, Y, and Z. They won't do vegan education, and in some senses they're opposed to it. So they become the vegans that the non-vegans rub shoulders with, and eventually learn a bit about veganism. But my position is that if you've got vegans who will do vegan education, then it'd be good to encourage them to do little else, because there's so few of us. First of all, there's so few of us who are activists. And I take my lead from Ronnie Lee. Now, I don't think you know Ronnie because you passed over his name the other day and you didn't know who he was. Now, Ronnie Lee's been vegan for 53 years. He was the co-founder of the Animal Liberation Front. And he says that what we need is vegan education everywhere and all the time. Now, who's going to do that? Only vegans, right? And so the extent to which vegans who will do vegan education get diverted to something else, I'd argue against them doing that and concentrate on what you do and stay in your lane type thing. That doesn't stop you as, okay, a welfarist doing welfare. You know, I got a blog entry from years ago, welfarists do welfare, big wow. Yeah, of course they do. They're welfarists, they do welfare. But that doesn't mean that vegans have to do it.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I certainly appreciate that you're thinking about it in terms of effectiveness then, like where's the best sort of marginal use of the would-be activists' effort. I think that there's the main thing I would say is like don't oppose welfarism. I don't know if that's something that you do oppose, but I see a lot of that in the vegan movement in general, like anti-welfarist, like I said, well, which I think is unproductive and unhelpful.
My position on that is that there's no way that I can tell anyone what to do. And so if they're going to do welfare, they're going to do welfare no matter what. In terms of whether I think they're wasting their time, I probably am for the various reasons that we've already discussed. But if you want to do welfare, then go for it. But I don't want vegans to do it. And I don't want a welfare position like yours to be called veganism, because it's not.
But do you agree? I'm not sure if we agreed in the end whether that actually... Do you recognize what I'm saying about like increasing the cost of producing animal products and therefore making it easier for alternatives to compete and stuff like that? Do you not think it's kind of towards the same?
That's a contentious issue, that. Because you've got the fact that you've got a process in terms of, I mean, one thing that's missing from that model that I've seen you talk about, and you've probably delved into this, so excuse me for that, is the subsidies. So what would happen then is if the farming side of it was struggling to meet their increased cost, the good chance is that the government will bail them out with increased subsidies, because farming, animal farming in particular, has always been bailed out by governments because they're specialist governments. So it wouldn't then impact on the farms, and it wouldn't necessarily impact on the consumer, because the government is taking the hit through taxes, which means, ironically, that vegans are paying for that.
That's certainly possible that would happen. I don't think it's a given, and I think in any case, like the longer term effects of that are going to be more and more governments thinking, hang on a minute, we don't actually want this sector that we're constantly having to bail out, and like at the taxpayer's expense, it's going to become an unpopular policy and stuff like that. So I think that, you know, even if something is like covered by some sort of insurance, it basically increases the cost of that insurance. And in the context of government doing bailouts, then it becomes something where alternative proteins become much more attractive to certain governments, because they see and they understand, well, we've got rising welfare standards here that we're going to have to, either consumers are going to have to fit the bill or taxpayers are going to have to fit the bill. But either way, it's like getting more expensive to run this whole thing. Meanwhile, alternative proteins are getting cheaper and getting better at some point, you know, and you do already see this in a lot of the less democratic countries, where China is putting massive resources into developing alternative proteins and like reducing the reliance on animals, because they understand its liability for our society to be dependent on so much feed being imported, right? It's a very resource inefficient way of producing food. See the same thing in the United Arab Emirates as well, where they're pouring a load of money into alternative proteins as a food security thing. So I think that we want factory farming to be a less appealing proposition from government's perspectives as well.
All farming. all animal farming?
Yes, but especially factory farming. And again, I'm like, it's just a numbers game, right? Like over 90% of farmed animals are in factory farms. They're having, their experience is much, much worse. So I don't disagree with that. But again, I would be like, you have to prioritize in terms of like what you're focusing on doing next.
Yeah, okay, let me try and unpick that a little bit, in the sense that if I understand you right, that model, the subsidies thing that you just talked about, now the government are going to get sick of bailing them out, you think, and so eventually there's going to be some kind of collapse of the system. Now, I think that is true if we're talking about a reduction in demand. You're saying it will be true if all you've done is introduce stricter animal welfare regulations, which then the farmers complain to the government. So you've got people like the cranky vegan, Jake Conroy, who would say that the government will forever bail out the animal user industries because they're powerful, they pay for a lot of politicians and everything else. What they wouldn't do is they wouldn't continuously bail them out if the demand side of it fell off. And that's back to vegan education.
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. I think you need both demand and supply side interventions. So again, I'm not like anti-vegan education or anti-vegan campaigning.
You don't need the same people doing it.
No, I suppose that you don't. But I wouldn't, I wouldn't encourage anyone working on welfare to be saying we shouldn't be doing vegan education, it's a waste of time and stuff like that. And I would likewise, I wouldn't encourage anyone doing the vegan education or the vegan outreach to be opposed to welfare reforms. And a lot of people.
That's one issue where we would disagree, I think, in the sense that you wouldn't discourage them doing vegan education, but those doing vegan education, I don't want them to get diverted because there's so few of us. There's so few.
But that's fine if it's like this is the marginally most productive way that I can spend my time. That's kind of fine. But I'm just saying, don't oppose it.
It's a vegan way of passing your time.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, veganism is about, ultimately we're talking about increasing the amount of justice and peace in the world. I know it sounds a little bit ironic and a little bit weak at the moment with what's going on in the world. I mean, the violence that is going on in the world. And of course, we know that, in terms of war, the main victims are our fellow animals. Far more fellow animals, individuals who get killed through war than human beings. Always has been. So we're trying through vegan education to bring about a world which the mindset of humanity is altered to be a more peaceful species. Now that is the vision of the pioneers, which I don't revere. It's not that. It's I agree with, and I think they set out their case. So I think anybody that wants to mess with the definition of veganism, you at least have some kind of duty to at least check out what they stood for, not because they were the founders, but because what they stood for was bloody good.
Yeah, and I think that the interpretation that you're presenting, I think, is closer to. Again, I think we're probably closer than I would see veganism as conventionally being perceived, or I guess perceived as in the most widespread way today. But what I'm saying is, so when I say don't oppose to welfarism, don't oppose welfarism, or don't oppose welfare reforms, mainly this is coming from a place of seeing vegans thinking that this might actually be counterproductive for people to be doing, and that, for example, it's like placating people and making them feel better about consuming animal products if they think that there's some sort of welfare assurances, and often those welfare assurances are kind of meaningless, which that certainly is a problem, and like non-enforcement of standards is a problem. But I don't think it's the case that the evidence I've seen in terms of like the impact of welfare standards on consumption is that, if anything, news about improvements in welfare standards tends to decrease consumption of those animal products rather than increase it. So some vegans will worry that, if there's a media cycle about increased standards for farming pigs, for example, then the net effect of that will be people going, okay, great, that's, we can eat more pigs now. But I don't think that is the case. I think that it more so goes in the other direction.
Back up that statement in the sense that this is why you ended up with groups like PETA endorsing animal user industries, because they came up with welfare things like, or giving a slaughterhouse designer, Temple Grandin, an award, right? It's like giving Trump an award. And so
but I'm not sure if that, I haven't seen evidence that it increases consumption.
Well, that's the reason that they do it, because they can then say, hey, our stuff is high welfare, right?
So if you're like one company doing it in a context where other companies are not doing it, then it's possible that you'll increase your market share by doing that. But I don't think it's increasing the overall number of animals being slaughtered.
Yeah, but you can't lag behind. I mean, if you're saying that, let's call, I think you said free range, let's call that high welfare. You said 70% move that way already. So the 30% are kind of lagging behind. Eventually, they're going to get the message that they're not up with they're not up with the scheme. They're going to have to get their shit together, right?
Yeah, and one thing that happens in that is now we're at the stage where it can actually be legislated, and that's a feasible thing for the government to do, because there's no majority of even the egg industry to oppose those welfare standards. And actually, when you get to, well, it ought to be when you get to up to 50% of the industry has adopted some new standard like cage-free, say, those producers, their incentives change from a position where they're saying, let's lobby against this in order to reduce our costs, to a position of favouring it so that their competitors have to have the same cost that they already have, right?
I mean, so your position, to me, is within the welfare paradigm. And to me, veganism is outside of that. And to the pioneers of our movement, we were kind of outside of that as well. And so we do know that there are a lot more people who will do welfare education than who will do vegan education. So it would be beneficial in the scheme of things if you started doing vegan education and abandoned what you're doing now, because there's loads of welfarists who can do what you're doing.
I mean, I am mainly talking about like what I think pragmatically helps most animals. Again, I do think that people should be vegan, and that is something that I talk about as well. But I do think that it's much more important in terms of helps more animals for people to be vegan 2.0, frankly. And if people are doing the donating and the organized activism and the sharing things on social media.
What does the word help mean in your sentence there?
Well, it'll be like some
roll them into free range systems or something like that.
That would certainly be part of it. I don't weight that as zero. But I even if you're focused only on slaughter, say, and not on quality of life, which I think is not a particularly tenable position. I think, like, obviously what we care about is the subjective experience of the animal ultimately. But even if you're focused only on slaughter, I think that still doing the things that I talk about doing is going to reduce that number more than by
but I mean,
personally observing veganism.
You run into that problem when you were talking to Virtue post-mortem, because you were talking about the air quality, which is from this PETA thing. The air quality in a cage-free system turned out to be a lot worse. Now, you were saying, okay, but you've got to look at overall welfare. And so then you need to break down the components of all that and then do your measurement and then tot it all up at the end. I mean, first of all, it sounds like a bit of a job, but also, from my point of view, a little bit grotesque. But, how do you know that any of that, because whenever you try to justify it, you started talking about what happens in human research. You were using words like subjective. Well, yeah, that's because because you remember you came up with, well, what about cancer versus broken leg? Well, right. You can ask the human which one, and you suggested that the chances are they're going to say, "I'd rather have a bloke and red, please," right?
Yeah.
But we impose these changes on our fellow animals because we can't ask them. And so how do we know? And that was part of your conversation. How do you know that what you've done with this reform is actually beneficial? Because there's now a new report saying you've made it worse.
Well, we can't ask them, but I think we can make reasonable inferences about like what is likely to be a better or worse set of conditions for animals. Animals can express like more fear or distress or discomfort or signs of right, like obviously there are things that we can infer about animals' subjective state of mind.
I'd infer that they want their liberation, but let's go back to a couple of.
Well, yeah, same. But I mean, so do you not think that rights can be violated to a different extent if that's the way that you think about it? I know that some people are allergic to the sort of utilitarian framing, but whenever I think about that, I think even if you're thinking about it as rights, you can have more or less rights violations going on, right?
Of course, yeah. I mean, rights can be violated, and they are. I mean, they're being violated this second all over the world. We know that.
Yeah, but some rights violations are worse than others.
Well, you could probably argue that on a case-by-case situation. It depends on, what you're talking about and when and all the rest of it. But going back to this bit here.
Well, like for example, in caged egg systems versus cage-free egg systems, I would say there are a greater degree, firstly, of rights violations going on in the cage systems, also number.
Well, now you've run into the problem that you ran into when you were talking to Vegan Postmortem, because they found out, well, it's a difference between being able to stretch your leg and being able to breathe.
Well, so the things that I pulled up in that conversation, the PETA report that we were discussing basically was expanding on the welfare arguments against cage-free systems. One of those is air quality. The idea is that if birds move around more, there's more dust in the air, they're going to have like worse quality than if they were in cages in terms of air quality. And as I said in that conversation, air quality is one component of welfare. And I don't, I'm not an animal welfare scientist. I don't know how to weight that as compared to other components. But the studies that I was looking, and so that PETA report was really only looking at the downsides of the cage-free systems, didn't make any attempt to kind of say this is the downsides of this system, this is the downsides of this system, which is worse, right? There wasn't an attempt to do anything like that. I've found a few reviews that had attempted to do that, and I think 2 out of 3 of those that I found said that there is less suffering, fewer rights violations, you might say, in the cage-free system. Well, no, I guess it is in terms of suffering they're making inferences about. Right. So less suffering in the cage-free systems were 2 out of 3 of the reviews I looked at, and 1 out of 3 said it was a wash. So I think on balance, I would tend to believe that there is less suffering in the cage-free systems based on the evidence that I've seen.
Yeah, but Chris, you're a researcher. You can't go on 3 studies. I mean, like, presumably you're looking.
I don't know how many systematic studies of that kind of thing have been done, but
yeah, but you're coming to that conclusion from the 3 that you've just mentioned that came up in that live stream. So you have to, you need kind of more longitudinal stuff. You need to look at the patterns of research. I mean, there's no point in me saying this. You know this, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, if there's some evidence presented, I haven't seen any evidence presented that welfare is worse in the cage-free system. Certainly, that PETA report was not purporting to show that. It was just kind of talking about bad things in cage-free systems. It didn't make an argument that they're worse.
It did say that, and you were wrong. They said
that. It didn't do any kind of comparison of the 2 systems. It just was talking about the ways in which
it did conclude, in part, that it ended up being worse.
It may have said that in the text, but it hadn't done the analysis to demonstrate that.
Okay. See, this is interesting because, again, see, I just slalom past all of this because of what I do, and I don't get into the nitty-gritty of trying to regulate atrocities, which is what welfare does. and it's just not my bag. And so, you know, I prefer for all vegans to be concentrating on animal liberation and let the welfarists do the welfare. It's as simple as that with me. I mean, I'm a kind of simple man, you know, kind of Forrest Gump. I'm not a smart man, but I know what veganism is.
I think you're smarter than you let on there, Rog. I mean, I think that, like I said, I do think that there's value in both of those approaches, and the main thing that I would say and want sort of people of your perspective to hear and to take from this, welfare improvements are not just about improving the conditions of the animals who are in those systems, although that I think that is a valuable thing, right? You'd rather be killed than tortured and then killed, and you'd rather be tortured and then killed than double tortured and then killed, right? Like, these are relevant things for the animal who's having that experience or not. But the main part is that there are also going to be fewer animals having that experience because of the cost pressure of that introducing these kind of systems puts. And one way of seeing that is that these businesses that are producing eggs, the egg farms, are going to be doing it as cheaply as they can. And if they require regulation to say you're not allowed to use cages anymore, I mean, if it was not sort of costly in some way, that legislation wouldn't be necessary because they'll be doing it already, right?
You don't think my point about subsidies is valid?
Again, I think that if that may happen in the short term and may even be used to offset price increases from improved welfare measures. Because I think in the long term, it will be like governments will have to come to acknowledge basically the more expensive.
Been bailing out animal farmers for decades and decades.
Yeah, but it's not a good thing on the international stage to have your food system be a financial liability like that. And so that's why countries which recognize this are moving towards.
What do you mean? They're in a globalized system, right? So it's not, it's like when farmers of every different country say we have the best welfare in the world. You know, they all say that, don't they? They always
do.
That's right. Yeah, but that can't be true, even if they wanted it to be true, because it's too expensive to do that. You have to do it on a global situation because it's a globalized thing. You know, the idea that one country can end up having wonderful animal welfare, they're going to price themselves out of the market, aren't they?
So there definitely is a component of that, and like imports of low welfare products are a problem to that kind of theory. But ultimately, you're going to get to a point, like ultimately the animal production systems are in competition with the alternative protein production systems. This is how I'm thinking about it. And the more restrictions of any kind that there are on those businesses, the easier that competition will become for the alternatives. And the animal industries know this because they're always trying to put restrictions on the alternative proteins, right? With the labeling thing you will have seen in the EU, you can't say meat for plant-based meat and all these terms. So
isn't that a demonstration of the power of the farming lobby?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a problem.
Oh yeah, of course. That's right. This is why we've got to weaken it.
But equally, 100%. Yeah, I agree with that. But equally, our lobby must be strong. And I think that if we realize that we're doing something very different from, I guess, what would be sort of symmetrical to what the other side is doing, it probably means we're missing a trick at this stage. That won't always be the case, and there can be situations where interests align. And actually, low welfare imports is one of those. So animal advocates and animal farmers can join and agree on this one issue, that we should not be importing animal products that have lower welfare standards than are legally required for production in the UK. Now,
to look at the methodology of how you would even work that out, though.
Of what do you mean, that agreement?
No, that for you to characterize some of the lower welfare standards, what would it mean, and would it be consistent? Would it change over time? Would it change from farm to farm? I mean, the idea that you can say that everything that comes off that ship is definitely going to be lower welfare standard. It's a case by case, isn't it? It might some of it might be higher.
Some of it could be, yeah. And yeah, you'd be looking at, like, obviously you want some way to assess that and evaluate, right, we're still importing eggs from cages from some country, for example, like, let's not do that. It's not allowed over here. And so you put restrictions of some kind on that.
Okay. Hey, look at this. I'm getting flack here.
Oh dear.
I'm getting flack from my own people. This is not good, is it? So I don't know if you've seen any questions you want to tackle or not. There's a question for Chris. Animal agriculture has expanded using welfare as a marketing tool. Even tougher welfare, as per the welfare laws, are not enforced or observed. Well, we are back to that problem of one of the major problems for you is that even if you go to the process of getting the legislation, it's a little bit like the hunting ban. Like, because the hunting ban came through a speciesist parliament in Britain, there's also there's a hunting ban on a deer farm in Ireland, right? Means very little. They're still hunting. So, you know, kind of, how do you regulate? Who regulates it? Who's going to do it? Are you going to do it?
I'm not going to do it, but I certainly would lobby for proper resourcing for agencies that will do that. And actually, I think that this is something that becomes more feasible with AI to some extent, that can be used to solve the resource problem, basically, of not having enough resources to monitor and evaluate and do prosecutions and so on for animal welfare standard violations. So there's certainly parts of the process that can be improved.
Yeah, I did notice you've got a video about you were welcoming AI, whereas a lot of people are worried
100%.
about the implications of it. But how does I mean, briefly, how does the AI thing factor into your thing?
Well, on welfare enforcement, you mean?
Yeah, what you were just saying, AI will help. How does it do all that?
Basically, anywhere where you can have systems that can automate what would have been a lot of human labor, then that's the bottleneck in terms of welfare enforcement. So, you know, whether it be drones visiting farms on an autonomous basis and like detecting things not being done properly that would have previously required a human to go around, you know, expensive human to go and stay in a hotel near the place and then get paid a salary and everything else. To the extent that you can just do this with technology, that will be, I think, allow us to make great strides in enforcement.
For controlled atmosphere stunning, you know, that it would cut down the amount of human interaction with our fellow animals, because you would take them off the transport truck, you know, on a pallet, as it were, in all the cages, and then you'd bung them into a gas chamber. So you don't have that thing. I mean, obviously at the farm level, you've got, you know, the catcher thing, and we've all seen that, you know, they grab the turkeys and they lob them in and all that. But it wouldn't happen at the farm side of it. But as I said, you know, now people realize that, you know, who would have known gas chambers are not great for sentient beings.
Yeah. So you're saying that they did that in order to reduce the extent of interaction with humans?
That's one of the Peter arguments, that it would do that. In the same way as they experimented with those kind of machines that gather them up rather than humans doing it, because humans got this tendency to use them as footballs and do all the rest of it that we've seen over the years.
I see what you mean. So if you're taking humans out of the processing system, the idea is that it becomes like you remove that.
But is that not what you just said about AI?
Well, it's a bit of a different thing, because I'm talking about like welfare inspections rather than processing that is going to go on in a different way. At the moment, there just aren't enough welfare inspections. There will be farms that will never be inspected because there's only one person doing the inspections in that council, and there's 1,000 farms, and so they'll just never get there.
Is this an updated AI version of CCTV in slaughterhouses type thing? Because that was brought in by Animal Aid, and then it was, funny enough, animal justice project exposed how rubbish that system that was brought in by animal aid was, because the slaughterhouses got around the fact that there was cameras, and they did all the horrible stuff out of the way of the cameras. It's like the coppers, when they had to tape people, they beat them up in the car on the way rather than when they're on tape. So people do find a way around these reforms. Who stops that?
Well, certainly there will still be cases of people being able to do that, but it's like I said about like people still do murders to some extent, but probably to a far lesser extent than if we didn't make murder illegal and say like we have some sort of system that's meant to enforce this, imperfect as it may be, right?
That's an interesting philosophical thing. If we made society more moral, we might not need those kind of laws.
Certainly, and I'm here for that, but I don't. I think that it's valuable to advance the cause in ways that don't require that. To me, that is a very difficult thing to do, and so to the extent that you can do, is an admirable thing to do, and it's a good thing if we can achieve it. But to the extent that you can reduce the suffering directly and basically circumvent the attitude change, like for example. Changing we were reading the thing about the other day about changing the defaults on menus to plant-based options, and the menu will still contain animal products, but you have to specifically request it. You're going to see some double-digit percentage decrease in the amount of people choosing meat just by changing the default like that. And it's a very tractable measure for places to introduce because there's no resistance to it, right?
Over the years, I've had people say that to me. Look, if I go into a restaurant and most things are plant-based or vegan friendly, I'd be fine. It's just that it's not at the moment. So I mean, kind of like anecdotally, I've kind of heard that position. But is there any research that suggests it?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, there's good experimental things with the menu defaults. A very common format for it is conferences. When you register to a conference, you might have to fill in a form about what you want to have in the dinner. And unless it's a vegan conference, you're going to have to tick the vegan box, especially to request your vegan meal, right? And if you
flip it the other way around.
Exactly, yeah, the food will be plant-based. If you insist on having meat, tick this box here. And the effect sizes in that kind of setting are genuinely massive. It can go from like 10% having the vegan thing to like 90%. So there's some studies where it's very, very strong. We did a sort of mini meta-analysis of these a couple of years ago, and I think the average there was about 30 percentage points drop in people ordering the meat dishes when the default is changed to plant-based like that. Now, one kind of interesting part of that is in a lot of settings there aren't necessarily defaults. Like if you order something in a restaurant, there's normally you just order what you order, right? There's not necessarily a default in that setting. So too in supermarkets. So it's somehow kind of situationally constrained, but there are other things that you can do, like on menus. There's a drop in the ordering of vegetarian options if you put them in their own vegetarian section, as opposed to mixing them in with the other options on the menu. And so I think that things like that, where it can be like, wow, we can actually get like 10% more people getting the plant-based thing here, and we didn't have to contend at all with the attitudes. Again, while I think it is good to contend with the attitudes and try and change the minds in the long term, it's I think it's also good there are kind of freebies where you can avoid that.
If you could change the attitude, then you wouldn't have that tension there at all. But I mean, you mentioned that chef you mentioned.
It's a big if though.
Jamie Oliver, right? He brought in healthy options to schools. Do you remember that?
And I do. I can't remember how much of a plant-based thing it was. I remember turkey Twizzlers being the enemy in that.
Yeah, well, it was. I think there was quite a few plant-based options available, and there was a bit of a kind of revolt from the parents and the kids, and so you ended up having this rota of parents going to the local burger van,
right,
from all the kids and everything.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah, because the culture hadn't changed.
Yeah, and I think and that's absolutely right. I think that you do need that demand side and change on the individual. I think of this as like the individual versus the institutional level. So with Vegan 2.0, the donation, the give more and the do more part are typically aimed at institutions, because the most effective charities will tend to be those which are doing institutional interventions, like trying to get governments to, right, there's the Danish government doing the plant-based initiative and so on. And so too with the do more, typically we're talking about taking part in cage-free campaigns, or also there's a great organization in the UK called Communities Against Factory Farming, and they basically lobby local councils to disallow planning permission for new factory farms. And they've had some great success in the UK at getting proposed factory farms either rejected or massively delayed.
Can you say more about that? What does it mean that our fellow animals who would have been moved to the shiny new factory farm stay in the dingy old ones?
No, I think it's talking about not increasing overall number of animals farmed. Right, this is like a new farm that's going to be set up in order to produce more animals, and now
aren't these new mega farms and all that they're stopping? Aren't they to replace the worn out old farms where it's actually difficult to look after welfare? I mean, I know this conversation's within the welfare paradigm, but isn't that likely to make the welfare worse if you stop a brand shiny facility from opening?
My understanding is that in most cases they're talking about adding production capacity rather than like replacing an old facility. What,
because of the demand that they can't meet?
Yeah, just to be able to be producing more.
They can't just open new places and stock them and sell everything if the demand has stayed the same, surely, because that's already been catered for, right? Unless you're talking about imports or something.
Well, it kind of depends, right? Maybe if there are more, if there's more production of a given animal product, then it can be supplied at a lower price. So maybe if they can reach that lower price, like there's an equilibrium in the market, but if there's more supply going on, it's possible they can reach a lower price, and
so it could be better welfare, lower price. How do you work that one out with the utilitarian calculus?
No, I don't think it's about better welfare. They're blocking construction of factory farms.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But you know, if you've got a situation where you've got in the area, you've got, I don't know, 50 small farms, and they can be quite problematic from your point of view in terms of what goes on in them, and you know, worn out. I mean, like, we know what it's like. You look at a factory farm or a slaughterhouse after a couple of years operation, and the place is a shit show, right? Whereas they're probably saying, well, look, we can come up with a big brand spanking new one, and we can do a lot for animal welfare that we can't do in the 50 small ones. I mean, is that taken into account?
I'm not sure if that's all what they're saying. It may be the case that the older facilities become unusable and they need to invest their money in making a new facility in order to create the same amount, same quantity overall, let's say.
But they might be transferring the individuals into a better situation, might they?
There could be cases where that is happening, but regardless, they want to produce this new facility. If the older facility, if it's like going towards not being able to be usable, clearly if you prevent the new facility from being
internal logic, Chris, making sure that a new farm or slaughterhouse or whatever doesn't get planning permission, that might actually backfire from a welfare point of view, depending on the circumstances, right? And we know that the reason that a lot of people object to it is their own health, environmental things, the smell,
pollution,
nothing to do with animal rights, of course, even nothing that much to do with animal welfare and that. But from an animal welfare point of view, you might actually say, no, actually, the opening of that thing is better than the situation as it is now.
There could be cases where that's the case. Like there are some cases where there's kind of a weird alignment of incentives on both sides. So, like,
why endorse a campaign which is just trying to to stop them being built if sometimes it might actually be beneficial from your point of view?
Well, the calculation is that most of the time it's not going to be. My tacit assumption, I suppose, is that's actually increasing the number of animals being farmed. If it were the case that they're all like replacing some older facilities which are worse welfare, then yeah, I guess that does change the calculation. But I don't know how many times that's the case versus actually preventing an increase in the capacity.
It would presumably, in your scheme of things, have to be looked into, because you wouldn't want to be making anything worse, even if it's only in a minority of cases, would you?
Well, there'll be trade-offs, right? So we were talking about the price of beef recently has gone up a lot in America, and so that's led to, there's a record low number of cattle being farmed in the US at the moment and record high prices for beef. And one of the parts of that is also record high profitability for cattle farmers. And we're looking at that and thinking, you could see how that would sound like it's a bad thing, right? We don't want this to be profitable. But in this particular case, it's because there was a lower supply overall. So there's actually a lower number of animals being farmed, and it still increased the profitability for those particular farmers who were still doing it. But we're saying in this case, like, this is still good because it decreased the number of animals being farmed. Now, normally what would happen is that the market responds to that and says, okay, there's an undersupply, and so more people are going to start farming cattle in order to meet that supply.
I'm not quite sure if I'm following you. If they're just rejigging where the exploitation takes place, how does that reduce the number of our fellow animals being used?
Again, there's an assumption here that some of what Communities Against Factory Farming is doing in blocking new factory farms from being built is decreasing the overall numbers of animals being farmed. I'm assuming that it's not 100% of the farms that are blocked are just bringing animals from somewhere else, in which case it
get involved with the campaign, and the subsequent press coverage makes people think, oh, I'm not going to eat any of that anymore. Is that what you're saying?
That can be a part of it. But I don't think there's just like, I think there are more factory farms being built such that more animals will be factory farmed if that's allowed to happen. I don't think it's just the same number of animals in different farms now.
That can't be true if the demand doesn't go up, can it?
Well, we're importing some amount of animal products currently, right? And so it can be.
I asked about imports as part of it before. Yeah. Have you seen this one? I don't know whether, because we're coming up to.
Yeah, we're coming up on 2 hours. I do have another conversation.
You do have another one,
at 5.
don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Do you want to get off, or do you want to take some of the questions, or what do you want to
do?
No,
we can go until 5, basically. Yeah.
Till 5. Wow. Okay. All right. Okay. So that's quarter of an hour. Yeah.
Yeah.
What did I say? It said something about that one. Suggestion that vegan 2.0 is obsolete because we've already got the welfarists doing it. And what I would add to that question is, so why associate what's already been doing by the welfarists with veganism, which it's not?
So my thinking in this, and I mean, it could be that it is if your definition of veganism entails some amount of activism. Again, I think that doing welfarist stuff is not just about improving welfare. It is actually reducing the number of animals being farmed, is reducing rights violations. So I think that's a really important thing that a lot of times is missed. So I'm keen to hammer that point home. But in terms of just like the branding of it, my thinking is in terms of where your efforts will be. And if you're trying to kind of achieve a reduction in suffering, reduction in rights violations, however you might be thinking about it, it just makes sense to focus on the ways that you can do that most efficiently. So, yeah, I mean, do you agree? I presume you do agree with the idea that some forms of activism are more effective than others in terms of reducing the number of animals farmed.
I think in terms of what veganism wants, there's nothing better than vegan education, because it's it's not about reducing, it's about stopping. And it's about, in addition to that, because of the scope of veganism, it's wider than just the animal question. And that's why I brought those slides up. It's about changing the mindset of humanity. In that, as I said, they had some really big ideas, right? And so the vegans who kind of understand and go along with that, that's where they're at. They're on this kind of thing of trying to change humanity. I know it sounds a bit poetic and fanciful and maybe utopian, but that's what veganism was kind of devised as initially.
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, I think I'm just very much focused on the practical how to do that, because I don't like. It seems pretty feasible to me that I'll reach the end of my life and there's still we won't have made the vegan world, right?
In the sense that I ask people this question and they always say yes. I always say, are there more ethical vegans out there? They always say yes. Say, okay, let's go find them, and let's not do anything until we've got them, right? And so, because my position, I think, could be challenged is if there wasn't any, but nobody ever says that. We all think that there are more ethical vegans out there, people who are exposed to the justice for all philosophy of veganism and then decide to adhere to it. They then.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. More potential people. Yeah. I agree with that, and I think that's definitely worth doing.
So that's what we should be doing then. So let the welfarists do the welfare, and the vegans do the vegan stuff, because there is vegans to be found.
Yes. I think again, I'm not opposed to people doing that kind of work. I think is important. But and then something that I would ask you on that: do you think that it seems to me obvious that the best way of doing this would be some sort of professionalized organization that has people on full-time salaries that can pay for billboards and other sort of paid media.
No, you've got me wrong if you're going down that way, because I was brought up in the movement
let's talk about
where
that.
there was a very, very strong grassroots, and the movement was very dynamic in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. And that was kind of grassroots led, so you've got the regional groups like Northern Animal Liberation League, all the stuff which is now in the history books. But the movement now is more corporatized than it was then. And so people were much more, how would you put it? They kind of self-actuated. They weren't hanging around for people to tell them what to do and all that. And so it was a much more dynamic movement back then. And it coincided with the fact when you've got a movement like that, it increases the amount of critical thinking and it increases the amount of political thinking in society. And that could be a break on the idea of trying to get that back again might be ruled out because human beings are not like they used to be back then. I accept that. That is a potential kind of answer to that aspiration. But I would say that the best thing we could do for the movement is not to professionalize, but to increase the grassroots and let them get on with it like it used to be.
I can certainly see, and again, I do think, basically the more people who are able to be involved in some capacity, the better. And that's why my focus is on like doing things which are incredibly easy for lazy, internet addicted young people to do, in terms of like donating, posting on social media, feeling like there's a feed where you fill out responses to consultations and email companies and stuff like this. I mean, I think that but I think there's, I can see certainly it's good for as many people to be involved in that as possible, basically. But I think that having some amount of people who are professional and guiding that and able to inform on strategy and make resources that can be used and organize.
Can you explain to me what's the advantage of these professionals?
Well, look, I think in any endeavor where you want to achieve something, it's often the case that having some professionals who are thinking about this full time and able to have the time to do it because their bills are being paid by doing it,
Okay, all right.
is going to be.
So
right.
it's about the money. So we could make loads and loads and loads and loads of people professional by supporting them through Patreon and that kind of stuff. And you don't need the professionals as we've got them now in the corporations, because I don't know whether you know this or not, but I've always had this thing. If you lined up all the professionals and they were there with their salaries and what they did, I think the movement would be incredibly shocked, because the amount of duplication in this movement is out of this world, right? So there would be a case for these professionals to spread themselves around the country and get involved on a community level with activism and all the rest of it. You don't need the corporate structure that we've got. I think there's a funding problem within the movement, which is increasingly corporatized, where you've got big companies who are kind of competing. I mean, Gary Francione says we don't have a social movement, we have a bunch of competing companies now.
Well, I can see what you mean, but I think that's probably a good thing. I think it's good that there are institutions that have to compete for funding and therefore are incentivized to do better and meet their targets that their funders will set for them and stuff like this. I think like funding individuals, seems to be kind of no accountability. Like there's some limited amount of resources that are going to go into.
The other way around, Chris. If you fund a local group and they're all over social media, you can see what they're doing on a weekly, hourly basis. If you give money to Animal Justice Project or Animal Aid, you haven't got a clue what that 20 quid's doing. If you give 20 quid to a local group and they said, we've just bought a new photocopier, you know what you've done with them.
Yeah, but like most donors are not going to be that involved in or informed and able to like evaluate, was it a better use of the resources for this group to buy a photocopy or for that group to buy placards?
How do you know that?
Well, how would you make those assessments?
They would make the assessment through monitoring stuff on social media, and look, we're all on social media.
But what if we could professionalize the monitoring? Like, I don't want when I donate to animal organizations to have to be like, it's up to me to be constantly checking that they're doing the thing that they said that they would be doing. And
what's wrong with that? You just go, okay, I've given 100 quid to X. Let's have a look on social media what they've done with it. You go, oh, I don't like that. I'll give it to somebody else. Whereas if you just give it, like with your ACE thing that you promote, you actually don't know where your individual donation goes, because it gets sucked up by a big corporation. You give it to a grassroots group, you got much more kind of, oh wow, they're really doing something with my money. It involves you, empowers you, and then you go, well, I'm going to make a group now.
I mean, maybe. I just think that most people don't have like. It's not reasonable to expect most people to be able to make those kind of judgments. Like this is why you have like financial.
You don't know, do you?
This is why you have like experts in like financial advisors or lawyers or something. It's good to have some sort of.
So I've already explained the weakness of my argument, but we used to have that in the past. It's not as though it wasn't possible. So it might be possible to get it again, but you're kind of poo-pooing it out of hand. On what basis?
Well, it's just you've no way of knowing if this particular group that you've given to is going to help more animals for that amount of money than some other group that you could have given to. We've got limited resources. We have to try and have some sort of situation. Like it's good if there's some sort of situation where there's organizations that have to track and evaluate exactly what they're doing, evaluate different interventions, make records of.
You mean increase the welfare of, don't you?
So for me, it will be some sort of like weighted utilitarian judgment about number of animals, X amount of suffering. And that will include better welfare standards. It will also include fewer animals being farmed. But the point here is that like most people are not in a position to make proper judgments about what's going to be more effective or less. Like it's kind of vibes based, right? If I give to my local group in Bristol, who knows? I mean, maybe I might be able to see what they like, look on their social media, see where they spent the money, but I don't know if that's better for animals than how some other group would have spent the money. I'm just not in a position to know that.
Well,
the
give
same
them
way I
some
wouldn't
money and
be in
then
a
go
position.
down and have a word with them.
Yeah, but
Or the other way
you'd have to
around.
you'd also have to have a word with all of the other organisations to see how they would have spent it instead, right?
What's wrong? What's wrong with that? We're in a social movement. We're not in a group of businesses. We're in a social movement. We talk to each other. Oh, you know what you're up to? Well, that sounds good. Here's a bit of cash.
Yeah, but if you were to treat investments this way, and you're just kind of like making random investments for whatever business is in your town that's looking for money.
I didn't say anything about random. You're
Well,
actually
if you're
not
talking about
doing
local
random because you're directing it. You're monitoring what you're doing yourself, right?
most people are not in a position to do it. Like if you're talking about giving to a local group, for
where
example.
you getting the most people are not in the position to, how do you know that? You've said that about 3 times.
Yeah, because like how you don't seem to appreciate that if you could observe what your local group is doing, you'd have to also know what every other group is doing that you could have given to, and like it's just an incredibly complicated question ultimately to make some sort of judgments on this. And it's a good thing if there are people whose job it is to make those kind of judgments and then advise the rest of us, like in finance, right? If you were to get like if you were to say, you know, invest in the businesses in your local town, for example, I mean, maybe they give a better rate of return than all of the other businesses in the country, but maybe they give a worse odds on they give a worse rate of return. So it's useful to look at some sort of metrics, have financial advisor maybe who will right, like there can be some things are better use of money than others. However, you're conceptualizing that. Some forms of vegan education, if you only want to talk about vegan education, some forms of vegan education would be more effective than others.
Yeah,
and you would rather give resources there than there.
We're coming to the end, but I mean, clearly between us, I mean, we've kind of got on, but there's a generational difference. But there's a, you know, like I mean, I'm into things like DIY culture. I'm involved in community things. The movement was very much more community based. I always tell the story that we would go on a SAB on a Saturday, and we'd do something more illegal on a Sunday. And then on a Tuesday, we'd be a Rock Against Racism gig. And then on the Wednesday, we'd be a Reclaim the Night march with the feminists. It was the same people because it was a left-leaning movement back then. And most people in it had similar values. And so there was a certain kind of self-perpetuating buzz about it then. And now it's back to Leonard and his professionals versus civilians slur, calling people civilians, for fuck's sake.
I think that's perfectly fine. Like if you're trying to, if we're talking about like setting up football teams, for example, right? And you say I'm going to be in a community and get people from get my mates together and form a football team, and I say I'm going to employ professionals who are professional footballers. My football team's beating your football team. I'm sorry, but like that's how things are. That we don't need to be
as much fun as if you did it on a Sunday with your mates. And
that's certainly correct. But I think that's what it comes down to. Like it sounds like a lot of fun doing like being in those communities and bit like going to all the marches or whatever. But I'm trying to score more goals, so I'm going to get the professionals to help, right? Like it's not about our experience ultimately.
The definition of goals now, I suppose, but well, I hope you found this productive.
I have, yeah. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and you know, I will say, any rudeness towards you in my live stream the other day aside, I do appreciate you, Roger, and I have a lot of respect for you. I was reading about you went to prison, part of ALF, and all this kind of stuff, and you know, I think we have some different.
We've all done that. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I think we have some different views on how we get there, but ultimately, it's good that we're on the same side, and we had a pretty productive conversation here. So I appreciate you.
I would ask you to consider. I know you've got the merch now, so this is a problem. I would like you to drop the name vegan, because it's not vegan as far as I can see.
Maybe that'll have to be a discussion for another time, because we have. Yeah. So one thing I have been toying with actually is moving from vegan 2.0 to vegan plus, and then it seems more like an addition rather than a replacement. But I have to. I have to see the implications of that.
I said on the Facebook thing, which is how we started this, that why don't you join Leonard and call yourself veganish? I'd be happy.
We'll see.
I'd be happy with that.
We'll see. I mean, I think as the distinction between vegan and vegan 2.0 is clear, then that can be you know, people can make of that what they will. But
you didn't make that case, though. That's the problem. You failed to make that case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there is a distinction between the two, and I think you just said they're not the same thing. But listen, I really have to go because I have another person waiting on another call. But
take care.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Roger. All right.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay. And for my people still in the chat, I think we can maybe just wind up. So I hope you got something out of that, because there's two different audiences being catered for here in a kind of weird way. But anyway, I think there's going to be an I'm Alright show tomorrow. Wendy in the chat will know. And until then, which might only be tomorrow, I'll see you again, Earthlings. You take care, and bye for now.